One second. I just want to shut off the phone. 1 second. Okay. This coming week is Parshas Rabbi, and among the many mitzvos that are discussed in Parshas Rabbi is the prohibition of eating milk and meat together. You should not cook. This is the way it's phrased in the Torah. Of course, the prohibition itself has a much larger scope, but that is something that is revealed by the Torah Shebe'al Peh, by the oral tradition, that lo sabashel di b'chalevimo, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Now, the Rambam, in discussing the prohibition of lo sabashel di b'chalevimo, not cooking the kid in its mother's milk, he says, "Ein isur el basar behemoth tahora b'chol behemoth tahora." That the biblical prohibition of eating milk that was cooked together with meat, or cooking milk with meat together, that only applies with an animal that one is allowed to eat. But let's say someone will use meat from a prohibited animal, an animal, let's say ham, something that is considered a non-kosher animal. So there is no biblical prohibition of milk and meat together because it has its own prohibition. The Bach's opinion happens to be that besides the prohibition of eating ham in general, if you cook ham together with milk, or you cook or fry ham with cheese, so besides the prohibition of ham, there would also be a rabbinic prohibition of milk and meat together. Others say, since it has its own prohibition, there was no necessity for the Chachamim, for the sages, to enact a special prohibition of milk and meat together. Okay. And then the Rambam goes on to say, V'gdi kolel vlad hashor, vlad haseh, vlad ha'ez. So when it says a kid, you should not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So a kid has reference to a young or an offspring of a sheep, an offspring of an ox, an offspring of a sheep, and an offspring of a goat. And the term in its mother's milk, now we know the prohibition of basar b'chalav, the prohibition of milk and meat together. It's really not, it's irrelevant whether it's its mother's milk or milk that was from another animal. So why is it that the Torah specifies its mother's milk? So the Rambam says, Ela shediber hakasav b'hova. The Torah spoke in the present tense, meaning in the present tense of the Torah. Now, the question is, what does that mean? So the Prisha, on his commentary on the Torah, says because it was commonplace that a kid, whether it was a kid goat or a kid of the sheep, would be nursed by its mother. So one who owned a kid goat usually had the mother there, and he would get milk from the mother. So the Torah is talking about the normal circumstances that existed at that time. However, I think there is another. This explanation is limited. Is a very limited explanation, and I think that there might be another explanation for Dibra HaTorah B'Lashon Hova. The way they understood the Dibra HaTorah B'Lashon Hova, which literally means in the present tense, meaning the present tense of the Torah, they understood that it was the commonplace circumstance, but the commonplace circumstance at that time. But I think that there's something much more to it than just that. Now, the prohibition of eating milk and meat together, and the biblical prohibition of eating milk and meat together is only where the meat was cooked in milk. Now, the prohibition of eating milk and meat together, it applies to cooking it. Let's say if I have a job as a chef and I just cook it, I don't eat it. But that's also prohibited. It's prohibited in eating. One is not allowed to eat it, that we know. And also one is prohibited. According to many opinions, it's somewhat lesser of a prohibition, but it's still a biblical prohibition to derive benefit from milk and meat that was cooked together. Matter of fact, one of the famous questions or common questions that come up, there are opinions that are lenient for reasons that are beyond the scope of this year, and there are reasons that prohibit it. But let's say when one has pet food, you have a cat, you have a dog, and very often, most often, the pet food is cooked with the meat and milk together. So certainly you're not going to eat it. There's no prohibition of eating it. You didn't make it. There's no prohibition of cooking it. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm not very knowledgeable on on how to take care of pets. But my assumption is that no one warms up the food that they feed their pets. But one is deriving benefits. So this is a question that the poskim already addressed, whether one could feed the animals, the pets that he has, with food, meat that was cooked with milk. Let's say it was beef. And the question focuses on the point that the beef obviously wasn't kosher. So the question is whether the prohibition of deriving benefit from milk and meat that was cooked together applies, whether it applies to beef that was not slaughtered in a halachic manner. Now, there's a pretty good assumption, in fact, it's more than assumption, that the meat that is in the cans of the pet food or whatever, however it's packed, there's a pretty good assumption that the meat did not have a halachic slaughtering. Consequently, those who permit benefit, deriving benefit, feel that the prohibition of deriving benefit does not apply to meat that was not slaughtered halachically properly. Now, but there are many opinions that disagree. From the Rambam, it appears that it's allowed, but from Tosfos, it appears that it's not allowed. Okay, now, so there are three prohibitions. There's a prohibition of cooking milk and meat together, eating milk and meat together, eating milk and meat, the biblical prohibition if it was cooked together, and there is a prohibition of deriving benefit from it. Now, how do we know these three prohibitions? Because the Torah 3 times, this is what our Gemara says, the Torah 3 times mentions the prohibition of lo sabashal di b'chalei vimo. Do not cook a kid, in the milk of its mother. Why does it mention it 3 times? So the Gemara says once to tell me that you're not allowed to cook it, once to tell me you're not allowed to eat it, and the 3rd time to tell me that you're not allowed to derive benefit from it. However, the Rambam mentions another, the Rambam raises the question, why does the Torah say that one should not cook milk and meat together? Lo sabashal di b'chalei vimo. Do not cook a kid in the milk of its mother. But why does the Torah mention? Why didn't the Torah tell us that? Why did the Torah just mention cooking? Why doesn't the Torah mention eating as well? So the Rambam says that we have to understand the prohibition mentioned in the Torah in the following manner: Lo sabashel di b'chalei vimo. Do not even cook milk and meat together. Not only is the prohibition against eating milk and meat, but the prohibition is against cooking as well. That's what the Rambam says. And the question is, what's going on here? Why is the Torah, what does the Rambam mean? Do not even cook it, but certainly eating it is prohibited. So some of the Nosei Kalim, some of the commentaries on the Rambam, they explain, but I think it's a very difficult explanation. They say that we find places where the Torah prohibited something, but because the Torah was concerned that a person might come to violate the prohibition as a geder, as a fence, as a preventive measure, the Torah prohibited something else. The Medrash mentions that God told Adam not to eat from the Eitz Hadas, not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Now we know he and Chava violated that prohibition. But when Adam told Chava about it, he didn't just say, do not eat. He said, do not touch it. So he made a geder. He made a mistake in the way he made that preventive measure. But our sages speak in positive terms of sometimes creating preventive measures in order to serve as a safeguard for a person coming to violate the prohibition in the Torah. And a matter of fact, there's a very interesting Ran on Psachim. I think it's in the Chedushei Haran on Psachim. The Ran on Psachim says, we know that there's a prohibition of eating chametz on Pesach, on Passover. And if one eats chametz on Passover, there's a chiyuv kares that's considered a pretty serious avera. However, but the Torah also prohibited owning chametz on Passover. And the Ran says, not everybody agrees with this, but the Ran says, why did the Torah prohibit owning chametz on Pesach, having chametz in your possession on Passover? It was as a preventive measure to serve as a safeguard to help the Jew keep away from eating the chametz on Passover. So some of the commentaries, I think it's the Maggid Mishnah. The Maggid Mishnah says that the same thing is true by basar b'chalav, that the Torah prohibited the cooking of milk and meat together because the cooking of milk and meat together would lead a person to either by mistake or whatever reason to come to eat it. But it was as a restrictive prohibition. Now, I have problems with that. I'm not certainly in a position to say it's not true, but I have problems with it because usually where we see a preventive measure, the preventive measure is more lenient than the sin it's coming to prevent. Let's say owning chametz on Passover, although it's a sin, it's prohibited, but it's more lenient of a prohibition than the sin of eating chametz on Passover. However, when it comes to cooking milk and meat together, so the prohibition of cooking milk and meat together is halachically as stringent as the prohibition of eating it. So that does not follow the normal pattern of preventive measures. But there is another explanation, and it's based, there is a certain story behind the other prohibition. When my grandfather came to America, there was a certain Jewish scientist, I think he lived in Baltimore, I forgot his name. My father mentioned the story. There was a certain Jewish scientist who used to do experiments. He was very much into trying to find out why the Torah prohibited certain types of foods. And so this scientist, he would take foods that were prohibited and do all kinds of experiments. There are those that believe, if there's some indication in the Rambam or Nevuchim to it, that the Rambam says kosher animals are more healthy than non-kosher animals. So he was going with this perspective that I assume he was going with this perspective that the scientifically prohibited foods might have something detrimental in them from a scientific perspective. And consequently, he would do all kinds of experiments. And of course, what was one of the most challenging prohibitions in eating, especially in those days, was things that were basar b'chalav, milk and meat, in the ingredients. And so people told him, now the prohibition of basar b'chalav, that involves not just eating it, but it involves cooking it as well. And in his experiments, he used to cook the basar b'chalav. So he came to New York to discuss it with my grandfather. And my grandfather said to him that he thinks now from the Nosei Kelim and Shulchan Aruch and from the Ramah, it appears that this is not something that a person should do. But my grandfather was talking from the perspective of the Rambam. My grandfather told him that he felt that according to the Rambam, it was allowed, because the Rambam says that we have to understand the pasuk as saying, do not cook a kid, do not even cook a kid in the milk of its mother. Certainly don't eat it. By implication, certainly don't eat it. So the question is, where is the implication? Where is the implication? Certainly don't eat it. So my grandfather said that the explanation of the Rambam is that when is it prohibited to cook milk and meat together? That's if you're cooking it for the purpose of eating. It doesn't have to be your eating. It could be even an animal's eating. But if it's being cooked for eating purposes, so that's what the Torah means. The Rambam means. The Rambam says, do not cook. Do not even cook milk and meat together for the purposes of it being eaten. Certainly don't eat it. So, but we have to understand what is the idea behind this, that it's the cooking for the purpose of eating. Now, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim discusses, the Rambam seeks out reasons for the various mitzvos of the Torah. And he struggled. Many of the mitzvos, the Rambam attributed to, in a sense, distancing ourselves from the practices of the people who were idol worshippers, from the practices of the idolaters. So, and the Rambam says, although he says he did not find the basis for this, but he says on the basis of the psukim of the Torah, not in this week's Sedra, but he says on the basis of the two other times in Chumash Shemos that the prohibition of basar b'chalav is mentioned. The prohibition of basar b'chalav is mentioned right after mentioning about the Jewish people being required on their holidays to go up to Yerushalayim. So it says it talks about the halachas and bringing the bikurim, bringing the first fruit to the Beis Hamikdash. So it talks about going up to Jerusalem in the times of the holidays. On that basis, the Rambam suggests that it was the custom of the nations of the world. When they had their holidays, the idolatrous nations, they would cook a kid, in the milk of its mother. So consequently, the Torah prohibited milk and meat together. Now, this explanation, and this is actually true about many of the explanations of the Rambam. It needs to be understood, because the Rambam attributes it to the reason for the prohibition of basar b'chalav is a particular form of milk and meat together, where there was a religious rite, R-I-T-E, that with idols to cook a kid goat or a calf or whatever in the milk of its mother. But we know that the prohibition of basar b'chalav and milk and meat is not a limited prohibition. It's much more general. This is the smallest part of it. So we have to understand why does the Rambam attribute such a narrow perspective in giving the reason for basar b'chala, in giving the tam ha-mitzvah, the reason for the mitzvah? It seems to be in a very limited situation. Now, so the Rambam says, so that's one thing. But with this in mind, we could explain everything else that we asked previously. In other words, when it says Dibra HaTorah B'Lashon Hova, when the Rambam says that the Torah is talking, even though the prohibition is a much more general prohibition, it includes all kinds of, the biblical prohibition, all kinds of domesticated animals. Nevertheless, the Torah phrases it about the kid, whether a kid goat or a kid cow, kid shore, ox. But the Torah phrases it, b'lashon hova, in the present tense, meaning because of the custom that existed in the time of the Torah and in the time of the patriarchs, among the umos olam, among the idolaters, to cook a kid in the milk of its mother. So that's perhaps what the Rambam means when the Rambam says Dibra HaTorah B'Lashon Hova. The Torah talked in the present tense. It wasn't talking just about the common practice, but it was talking about the ritualistic practice that existed at that time among the idolatrous nations. Now, so we have to understand, but why does the Rambam give such a limited explanation for such a general prohibition? Now, the Rambam, in discussing ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, the literal translation of the Torah, of course, we're not allowed to paskin that way because our sages in the oral tradition said that that is not the law, but the simple reading of the Torah is that someone who puts out an eye of his friend has his own eye put out. Ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. And that is true about all kinds of wounds. And the question is, and the Rambam says, because a person who put out his friend's eye deserves to have his own eye put out. That's how the Rambam explains it. Very harsh. And then the Rambam says, I know that you're going to ask me a question. Our sages say that it doesn't apply in the literal sense. He says the purpose of this book, meaning the Moreh Nevuchim, of this text, is not to explain the tradition of the sages, but the purpose of this book is to explain the literal translation of the Torah. Obviously, it's not 100% that way, but that's the general approach. And the question is, what is the Rambam saying? The Rambam himself says that if one doesn't believe in the Masorah, in the tradition that was handed down from generation to generation, if he rejects the halachos, the laws of the sages, so the Rambam says he's an apikoros, he's a heretic. So how could the Rambam just ignore the words of the sages and accept and just explain the Torah in the literal form. So it seems that according to the Rambam, there is a special, that the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, has significance for learning purposes, even though the practice is different than the way it literally is said. Now, and I want to offer two explanations to this. One explanation, first explanation, I'm less confident about the first explanation. I'm more confident about the second explanation. But the first explanation is, we know that one is not allowed to teach Torah under normal circumstances to non-Jews. But that is limited to the oral tradition, according to many, according to the Nitziv. Rabbi Kiva seems to have a different opinion. But according to the Nitziv, according to the Brisker Rav, according to the Brisker Rav, that is limited to the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition. But the prohibition of teaching Torah, it does not apply for a non-Jew to study, I should say. For a non-Jew to study, Torah does not apply to the written Torah, the Torah Shebechsav. Now, and it's interesting, the Rambam and the Tshuvos, there are two translations. The Rambam distinguishes between teaching Torah, he's talking there about Torah Shebechsav, but teaching the Torah Shebechsav on the basis of the oral tradition. He distinguishes between teaching it to Christians and teaching it to Muslims. He says to Muslims it is prohibited. Why? Because the Muslims believe that the Bible was corrupted. So they treat the Bible with disrespect. He says, however, the Christians, they had a respect for the Bible. This is in the Tshuvos. And consequently, one would be allowed, except in their tradition, they were not given over the proper explanations. So the Rambam says that one can teach them the Torah. And it's interesting, but there are two translations of that Tshuvos Rambam. One explanation of the Tshuvos Rambam is that in teaching them over Torah, you can only teach them those parts of the Torah that are applicable to them. The Shiva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 Mitzvos of the sons of Noah. And there might be, as we'll see a little bit later, other parts of the Torah that are applicable to them. And according to a later translation, I don't know Arabic well, I can't suggest my own opinion, although the second translation seems to be better, and that's a general rule, that when you have two translations, and if they were both done honestly, usually the second translation is better because the second translator saw the first translation usually. So he was able to see where improvements could be made, where mistakes might have been made. So the Rambam says that, it seems to say that no, it's not just limited to the parts of the Torah that are applicable to them, but it seems to the whole Torah. My sense is that when he says to the whole Torah, certainly according to what it applies only to the Torah Shebechsav, to the written Torah. Why to the written Torah? I think that Divrei Sofrim, the tradition of the sages, our sages say, is held in higher esteem than Yeno Shel Torah, than the wine of the Torah. In other words, the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, is open for the whole world to see. When it comes to the oral tradition, certainly until the time that the Gemaras were put into writing, the oral tradition represented the personal relationship between God and the Jewish people. So a person could suggest that from a certain perspective, of course, the Torah Shebechsav was given to the Jewish people, but it was given to the Jewish people in a sense that the whole world will see it. Whereas the Torah Shebi'al Peh, the oral tradition, was given in a manner that was given over from orally. It couldn't even be put into writing to study among the masses until it absolutely became necessary. But under ideal circumstances, the oral tradition was a private, personal relationship. Now, the Rambam says in Hilchos Malachim, also in his Parish Mission in Zrayim, that a non-Jew that performs a mitzvah, now I'm not talking about the 7 mitzvos, but almost any of the other mitzvahs of the Torah, Shabbos being one of the possible exceptions. The non-Jew performs one of the other mitzvos of the Torah, so he has a reward for it. But he has the reward of Eino Mitzvah Bosa, one who is not commanded in it and does it anyway. And my uncle and Moshe Feinstein, they suggested that the Rambam was talking specifically about the rational, the logical mitzvos, the mitzvos that I would have thought of myself. Very often, mitzvos that have to do between one person and another, and even mitzvos that have to do between man and God. There are certain mitzvos that if the Torah hadn't mentioned it, I would understand that it's a noble thing to do it anyway. So my uncle and Moshe Feinstein both said that when the Rambam says that a non-Jew who performs the mitzvahs of the Torah, fulfills a mitzvah, he's talking about the rational mitzvahs. I always had trouble with that because there's a Tshuvas HaRambam. The Tshuvas HaRambam says, now there are Rishonim that disagree, and I wouldn't recommend anybody do it today for other reasons, but that a non-Jew that wants to have a circumcision done on his child, and he goes to a Jewish moel, a Jewish circumciser, to perform that bris. So the Rambam says if he's doing it not for health reasons, but he's doing it because it's a mitzvah in the Torah, and he wants to perform the mitzvah that's in the Torah. So the Rambam said he allows it for being done. Today, I would not suggest that people do that, because when you do that, when there's a bris milah, there is an assumption that the child is Jewish. And there is no intention to circumcise the children for the child to be Jewish, and there's a circumcision, and especially if the Moel gives him a certificate, it'll be assumed that the child is Jewish. People might say, I remember the bris. So it's not something that's advisable. There was in the late 1800s a big dispute about it between regarding New Orleans, because in New Orleans there were many Jewish men who intermarried, and they wanted a circumcision on their children, and but the wives would not let the child undergo conversion. So there was a whole dispute, and the dispute was between many of the Golim in Europe, but it's centered around the Jewish community of New Orleans, whether to allow it or not. And those who allowed it, one of the reasons given is because of this Rambam. Okay, whatever it is, but certainly bris milah is I wouldn't call it a rational mitzvah. It's a ritualistic mitzvah. And still you see the Rambam says that if a non-Jew wants a bris milah for his child, a circumcision for his child, because it's a mitzvah in the Torah. So now we're not talking about those that want to do it because of the Judeo-Christian religions, but if he calls it's a mitzvah in the Torah, and he believes in the Torah's Moshe, and he believes in the Torah of Moshe, but he doesn't want to become Jewish. So it's permitted according to the Rambam to do it. So you see that a non-Jew, according to the Rambam, even though he's not required in the mitzvahs of the Torah, only in the Shiva mitzvahs, but he is considered to be performing some mitzvahs as well. So and I mentioned this to Rav Aaron Felder, who was one of the outstanding Talmidim of Moshe Feinstein, and I showed him the Chivas Rambam, and I showed him the Rambam Parashah Mishnah in Zerayim, and he agreed with me. Matter of fact, he even repeated it in one of the shiurim, public shiurim that he gave. So, but it could be suggested, with certain limitations, that when a non-Jew fulfills the mitzvah, he doesn't have to fulfill it completely in accordance with the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral tradition, because the oral tradition represents that personal relationship between God and the Jewish people. But the non-Jew is not required, but he is considered to perform the mitzvah in the manner that the mitzvah is mentioned in the Torah Shabbat, in the written Torah. Now, obviously, there are limitations on this. Now, there is a difference, I think, between the way a Jew is required to observe the Mitzvos HaTorah and the way a non-Jew can perform the mitzvah of the Torah. A Jew, when he performs the mitzvahs of the Torah, he performs the mitzvahs of the Torah as an act of submission. The reason for the mitzvah is irrelevant. There is no reason for the halacha itself that we comprehend. We do it as an act of submission. However, when a non-Jew wants to get the reward of the Torah, wants to do a mitzvah that's mentioned in the Torah, we could suggest that it doesn't have to be done as an act of submission, but it has to be done because the reasons for the mitzvos make it very appropriate for something to be done. So the tamei ha-mitzvos, the reasons for the mitzvos, that in a sense is a universalistic perspective of the Torah. The Torah shebechsav has a certain sense of universalism that the Torah shebal peh doesn't have. And we could say that the reason, to a certain degree, the lesson is that a non-Jew who wants to sever himself historically from the idolatrous practices, so the Torah is telling him, there are the idolatrous practices, the practices that were associated with idolatry, even though you are not doing it for idolatrous reasons, keep away from it. That's the idea. Lo savashel di b'chalei vimo. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Distance yourself. You're not required to. But it's appropriate and it's a mitzvah to distance yourself from the practices of the idolatrous nations, even though you are not doing it for idolatrous reasons. So we could say that that's the explanation, but I think that there is a better explanation for it. And that is, there is a lesson. The Torah, according to the Rambam, there is a lesson in the Tamei HaMitzvos. But the Tamei HaMitzvos, the reasons for the mitzvos, are not the reasons, as I mentioned, that we perform the mitzvah. In fact, the reasons for the mitzvah doesn't have to do with the way we're required to perform the mitzvah. It has to do with the way the Torah presents itself. With the Torah presents the mitzvah in the Torah Shebechsav, in the written Torah. Because the Torah wanted us to learn from the reasons for the way the Torah was presented. The Torah presented the mitzvah in the Torah Shebechsav, in the written Torah, in order to teach us a certain lesson. Now let's take the lesson of Ayin Tachasai. The halacha is that if someone puts out someone's eye, he doesn't have his eye put out. He has to pay him money. Discussion, how to evaluate it. But the Torah wants a person to know what he really deserved. The Torah had Rahmanas on him. But the Torah wants the person to know what he really deserved. And the Rambam says that explicitly in the Yad HaChazar. And by basar b'chalav, I think the Torah is telling us by basar b'chalav that lo sabashel di b'chalei vimo, even though the prohibition of milk and meat applies to any meat and any milk. It's not limited to a kid in its mother's milk. But the Torah is telling us, be aware of trying to imitate the rituals of the nations of the world. Sometimes, because we find ourselves among the nations of the world, especially in Golos, especially in exile, the way they serve their God, the way they practice their religion has an impact upon us. The Reform movement, when it first began, they built their temples to resemble the churches. Reform movement, when it first began, they changed the observance from Shabbos, Saturday, to Sunday. That has changed. In a sense, it was the Christianization of Judaism. The bringing of the organ into the synagogue. It wasn't because, as some try to suggest, don't fool yourself and don't try to fool yourself, because they had musical instruments in the Beis HaMikdash that the Levium did. It was not to imitate the Beis HaMikdash, it was to imitate the churches. And even among the Orthodox, more recently, I would say the last 30 years, you see, certainly not around the general public, but there is what I would call the Buddhization of Judaism, borrowing from Middle Eastern religions. The idea of meditation, they read the way Buddhists worship, and they try to include that in the worship of Judaism. So the Torah warns us, when it presents the prohibition of basar v'chalav, it doesn't talk just about milk and meat. That leaves to the Torah Shebaal Peh, to the oral tradition, to tell us about it. The Torah warns us, be careful. Do not be influenced. Do not be impressed by the ritualistic traditions of other religions. I mentioned when I graduated college, the head of the UN was the guest speaker, Uthant. And Uthant said, let Buddhists be better Buddhists, let Jews be better Jews, let Christians be better Christians. That's right. We do not have to imitate anybody. We just have to be better Jews. And this was, in a sense, today you don't see it, but there was a time when Hanukkah became people would have a Hanukkah bush. They let the practices of the other religions infiltrate their ritual. Even today, I read an article where a certain Reform rabbi, she suggested that we should make Hanukkah during the Christmas period. What does all this come from? This is Judaism emanating from universalism. We have to be concerned about the world. We have to be dedicated to the world. We're part of the world. We have to be concerned about the poor and the hungry of the nations of the world. We're required to be a partner of God, who's the sustainer of the world. But our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism, not our Judaism from our universalism. Unfortunately, things that only a short while ago among the Jews was considered not only prohibited, but people would be aghast at because the standards changed in the world. Somehow the standards changed in the practice of the Jewish religion. We have to understand. We have to be concerned about the world. We have to be concerned about people starving in Biafra. We have to be concerned about bloodshed in all the countries. But our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism. Our Judaism should not emanate from universalism. And it's very interesting. The Chumash in Perek Yud Beis, this week's Sedra, Pasuk Lamed. Torah says, after you enter Eretz Yisrael and you will be at war with the Canaanite nations, and after you settle in the land, and after you were victorious and time passed, so beware for yourself, lest you be attracted after them. After they have been destroyed before you, unless you seek out their gods, saying, how did these nations worship their gods? And even I will do the same. The Esatain Gamani. And there is a discussion between Machlokes, between Rashi and the Ramban. What does it mean, and I will do the same? Rashi says, I will do the same. You just want to understand how they did it. Ultimately, you learn to worship idols yourselves. But the Ramban says, the Asagamani, and I will do the same for Judaism. God doesn't want us to do the same for Judaism. We, as Uthan said, let Christians be better Christians, let Buddhists be better Buddhists. But let Jews be better Jews. We have to do our own thing. We have to follow the Masorah. We have to follow the tradition of our ancestors. This is the lesson of Tam Basar, why it's phrased in this manner, to teach us a lesson. It doesn't have to do with the fulfillment for the reason for the observance of Basar B'Cholav. Basar B'Cholav we observe because we submit to the will of God. But the reason is to teach us that we have to separate ourselves from the religious practices of the nation. Because ultimately, if we do not separate ourselves from the religious practices of the nation, we let their practices become our practices. And the Torah does not need to be approved, does not need to be based on the practices of the other nations. It has to be based on the word of God to our ancestors, and that was given over from generation to generation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, please put questions in the chat. We had one question. If a non-Jew performs a mitzvah out of Ava, would that confer a greater or more meritorious status for schar mitzvah?
It would have more schar than Ava, but the general rule is a mitzvah that is required is considered on a higher level than a mitzvah that is not required.
Okay. Any other questions? Please put it in the chat. No, it doesn't look like there's any more questions.
Okay, fine.
Thank you very much. Have a good week.
Next Sunday. Okay, everything should go well.